She is scrubbing her hands at the kitchen sink, 1954, and the doorbell is going to ring in exactly 12 minutes. The smell of onions is still on her fingers. Nobody told her what to do next. She already knows. The 1950s Hostess ran an engineered illusion so complete that guests never once suspected the machinery behind it. To understand why these tricks existed at all, you have to understand what the post-war years actually did to the American home. The economic boom of the early 1950s pushed millions of families into brand-new suburban houses, and the middle-class housewife suddenly found herself without domestic staff, without the extended family networks of the previous generation, and completely responsible for running what amounted to a small private hotel. She was the cook, the decorator, the social director, and the seamstress, all at once, in a house she may have moved into only months before. These tricks did not fade gradually. They vanished with a kind of sudden completeness that is still striking when you look back at it. By the late 1960s, the feminist movement was reshaping how women thought about unpaid domestic labor, and the rigid perfectionism of the hostess rulebook became one of the first casualties. The potluck replaced the dinner party. The buffet replaced the plated course. The idea that a woman should engineer an illusion of effortlessness for her guests started to feel, quite reasonably, like a form of invisible punishment. The rulebook was not just set aside, it was actively rejected. Here is the interesting thing happening right now, in 2026. Research is showing that Gen Z is throwing more dinner parties than any generation in recent memory, and they are doing it with real enthusiasm. But many of them are discovering, sometimes the hard way, that gathering people in a home and making it feel genuinely warm and intentional is harder than it looks. The architecture behind it, the preparation, the sequencing, the quiet signals, all of that got lost when the rulebook was thrown out. They have the desire. They are missing the blueprint. What I want to be clear about before we go any further is that these were not simply good manners or quaint social customs. They were a sophisticated interlocking system. Each trick supported the next one. The scent ritual connected to the apron swap, which connected to the 30-minute rule, which connected to the greeting at the door. Pull one thread, and the whole fabric held differently. These women were running a production, and they were doing it without a director, without a stage manager, and without anyone acknowledging that a production was happening at all. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud. The rules these women followed did not come entirely from instinct. They came from a surprisingly robust publishing ecosystem. Post-war hostess manuals, including widely circulated titles like How to Be a Good Hostess, were sold in department stores, given as wedding gifts, and passed between neighbors. Women's magazines like Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens ran regular columns that reinforced the same principles month after month. These were not obscure texts. They shaped the expectations of an entire generation of homemakers, and they were specific, technical, and completely serious in their instructions. Picture her 2 days before the party. She is not standing at the stove yet, and she is not polishing silver yet. She is standing at the open pantry, and she is checking something specific. Not the ingredients for Saturday's menu. She is checking the shelf that lives behind the everyday cans, the one that is never touched on a regular Tuesday. It is already stocked. It has been stocked for weeks, possibly months. This is the emergency shelf, and it is one of the most quietly brilliant things the 1950s Hostess ever invented. The emergency shelf was not a vague concept. Hostess manuals were specific about what belonged on it. A canned ham, which could be sliced and plated in under 5 minutes. Tinned olives, salted nuts in a sealed jar. Cocktail crackers in a tin, not a box, because tins kept them crisp. These were not random pantry staples. They were chosen because they required no cooking, no refrigeration, no last-minute preparation, and they could be arranged on a plate or a tray and carried to the living room looking entirely intentional. The shelf was a hospitality kit, pre-assembled and waiting. The rule around the emergency shelf was absolute, and the manual stated it plainly. That shelf was not for the family, not on a Wednesday when the children were hungry, not on a Friday night when you wanted a snack before bed, not ever, under any ordinary circumstances. The moment you dipped into it for everyday use, you had dismantled your own safety net. The discipline required to maintain it was part of the point. It was a practice in keeping a promise to your future self, a version of yourself who would be standing at the door in 12 minutes with unexpected company coming up the walk. What the emergency shelf actually gave a hostess was something money could not buy in the moment: composure. When a neighbor appeared unannounced, or when a husband called from work to say he was bringing someone home for dinner, the woman with an emergency shelf did not panic. She did not apologize. She did not say, "Oh, I have nothing in the house." She walked to the pantry, pulled the tray together, and received her guest with the same calm she would have shown if the visit had been planned for a week. The shelf was the foundation under her confidence. There is a philosophy embedded in the emergency shelf that modern hosting culture has almost completely lost. Today, we think of hospitality as something we activate when an invitation goes out. We plan, we shop, we prepare for that specific event, and then it is over. The 1950s hostess understood hospitality differently. It was a state of readiness, a posture you maintained continuously, not a performance you mounted for a specific audience on a specific night. The shelf was physical proof of that posture. It said quietly and without announcement, "Someone is always welcome here." Imagine the neighbor who shows up on a Wednesday afternoon without calling ahead, which was far more common in the 1950s than it would be today. She knocks. The housewife opens the door. There is no flicker of alarm, no glance back at the kitchen, no hesitation. She says, "Come in," and means it completely. Within 3 minutes, there is something on the coffee table. Within 5 minutes, there is something to drink. The neighbor leaves feeling genuinely welcomed, not accommodated. She has no idea that a shelf in the pantry made that entire feeling possible. That invisibility was the whole point. The emergency shelf took care of the body, of hunger, and something to hold in your hand. But the tricks that came next operated on a completely different register. They managed what guests perceived without ever consciously noticing: the smell of the room, the scent of the hostess herself, the visual impression she made at the door. These were sensory tricks, and they were just as deliberate and just as carefully maintained as anything on that pantry shelf. The 1950s hostess understood, with a kind of practical genius, that a guest's impression is formed before a single word is spoken. The kitchen on a dinner party day smelled like everything that had been cooked in it: fried meat, rendered fat, onions, garlic. That smell, allowed to drift into the entry hall and the living room, would announce the labor before the hostess could. The solution was a small pot on the back burner, filled with water and simmering with cinnamon sticks and whole cloves. Not boiling hard, just barely simmering, releasing a warm, spiced fragrance that moved through the house ahead of everything else. By the time guests walked through the door, the kitchen smell had been replaced by something that felt festive and intentional rather than effortful. The room could be managed with a simmering pot. The hostess herself required something more direct. Garlic and onion absorb into the skin of the hands in a way that soap alone does not fully address, and a hostess who shook hands at the door carrying that scent had, in the logic of the era, broken something important. The solution was a hand ritual performed at the kitchen sink in the final minutes before arrival. Lemon juice rubbed into the palms and between the fingers to cut the scent, followed by cold cream, worked into the hands and wiped clean, leaving the skin soft and completely neutral. It was a vanishing act performed on herself. Why did this matter so much? Because the central illusion the 1950s hostess was maintaining was that the meal had arrived in the dining room through some graceful, effortless process that had nothing to do with hours of physical labor. The moment a guest detected the kitchen on her person, the curtain moved. It was not about vanity in the shallow sense. It was about protecting the experience she had worked all day to create. The scent of garlic on her hands would pull every guest's attention, however briefly, to the backstage machinery she had worked so hard to keep invisible. Picture the scene in those final minutes. She is at the sink, working the lemon into her palms with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times before. The cinnamon pot is simmering quietly on the back burner behind her, doing its slow work on the air. The clock on the wall says she has 8 minutes. She rinses, reaches for the cold cream, works it in, wipes her hands on the kitchen towel that will not be seen by anyone tonight. Then she dries them on the good towel, the one that stays in the kitchen, and she turns away from the sink. The kitchen part of her evening is finished. Now she needs to change. Not her dress, which has been carefully chosen and put on before the cooking began. What she changes is the apron. The 1950s Double-Apron System is one of the most practical and most overlooked tricks in the entire Hostess playbook. The work apron, heavy cotton or canvas, has absorbed everything the day produced. Flour dust, grease splatter, the wet mark from a dish towel tucked at the waist. It has done its job completely. It comes off. What goes on in its place is something else entirely. The hostess apron was not designed to protect anything. It was designed to be seen. Typically a half apron, meaning it covered only from the waist down, it was made from sheer or semi-sheer fabric, often organdy or fine cotton, and it was embroidered with small flowers or edged with rickrack or lace. Some women had several, each matching a different dress. It was completely impractical as a cooking garment, which was precisely the point. Wearing it said, "I have finished cooking. I am now your hostess. The labor is behind me, and the evening is ahead of us." The signal the hostess apron sent was layered in a way that takes a moment to fully appreciate. It acknowledged that she had cooked. Yes, she was not pretending otherwise, but it also announced that she had cared about her appearance while doing it, that she had maintained her sense of self through the work rather than being consumed by it. And it happened 10 minutes before the first guest arrived, not as an afterthought. This was a costume change, as deliberate as anything a stage actress would make in the wings. The kitchen was the wings, the living room was the stage, and the apron swap was the signal that the performance was about to begin. The swap happened exactly 10 minutes before the first guest was expected to arrive. Not 15, not 5, 10. That timing was deliberate. It gave her just enough runway to check her reflection, smooth her hair, and walk back into the kitchen one final time to confirm everything was in order. It was a costume change as much as it was a practical swap, and the women who did it understood the difference between working in a home and performing in one. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud about that little embroidered apron. Nobody announced its purpose. No guest ever watched the swap happen. The hostess simply appeared at the door looking like a woman who had perhaps arranged some flowers that afternoon, not one who had been on her feet since 7 in the morning. The apron carried all of that hidden labor in its clean folds, and the guests received only the composed, pleasant version of the woman who had made it. Postwar hostess manuals were remarkably specific about timing, and one rule appeared in nearly every version with the same firm language. All cooking was to be finished a full 30 minutes before the first guest arrived. No exceptions were offered, no allowances made for complicated recipes or large gatherings. 30 minutes was the buffer between the woman who had cooked the meal and the woman who would greet the people about to eat it. Those 30 minutes were not downtime. They were the most important preparation of the entire evening. So what did she actually do with those 30 minutes? She went to the vanity. She repinned any curls that had loosened in the kitchen steam. She pressed a fresh application of lipstick, blotted it carefully, and checked that her collar was straight and her earrings were on. She composed her face the way an actress composes herself in the wings before stepping out. The physical act of cooking was finished, and the performance of effortless hosting was about to begin. The 30 minutes was the intermission between the two. The goal of the 30-minute rule was a specific and carefully constructed illusion that the meal had somehow materialized on its own, that the table had set itself, that the roast had simply decided to appear. The hostess was meant to look as though she had been waiting leisurely for her guests rather than racing against a kitchen timer. Every trace of visible effort was considered a flaw in the performance. The food was the evidence that work had been done. Her appearance was meant to be the evidence that it had cost her nothing. The manuals were not gentle on this point. Several editions of widely circulated post-war hosting guides stated it plainly. A hostess who appeared rushed, flustered, or who mentioned the difficulty of preparing the meal was considered to have committed a social error. Sweating in front of guests was specifically cited as poor form. Apologizing for the food before it was tasted was equally discouraged. The unspoken contract was this: you invited these people, and your invitation was a promise that you had everything under control. Mentioning otherwise broke the promise. Picture the moment it all came together. She hears the crunch of tires on the driveway, the first car pulling in from the street. The kitchen is clean. The apron has been changed. The lipstick is fresh. She does not rush to the window to look. She walks at a measured pace to the entry hall, and she is already standing there, unhurried, when the doorbell rings. That walk from the kitchen to the front door was the final act of the 30-minute rule. She had engineered herself into a state of apparent calm, and it had worked. If the kitchen was the engine of the evening, the powder room was its report card. The guest bathroom was treated, in post-war hosting culture, as a direct and personal reflection of the homemaker's standards and, by extension, her moral character. This sounds extreme to modern ears, but the logic was consistent with how the era understood the home. Every room you allowed a guest to enter was a statement about who you were. The powder room was the one room a guest entered entirely alone, without the hostess present to manage impressions. The rules for the powder room inspection were precise. It was to be completed no later than 30 minutes before guests arrived, mirroring the kitchen timeline exactly. Fresh hand towels were laid out and aligned with care, not simply draped. The soap dispenser or soap dish was to be completely full, never down to a sliver. Extra toilet paper was to be visibly stocked, not hidden under the sink. The mirror was polished. The floor was swept. Nothing in the room was to suggest that real people had used it that morning. Here is where the powder room produces one of the most quietly human paradoxes of the entire 1950s hosting system. Those embroidered linen hand towels, pressed and perfectly arranged, were so pristine that guests were genuinely reluctant to use them. Women who lived through this era have described the same experience, standing at the sink, hands wet, looking at those beautiful folded towels, and simply not being able to bring themselves to disturb the display. So they dried their hands on the inside of their own skirts or slacks and left the towels untouched. Clara's note on this paradox is worth sitting with for a moment. Those towels were never meant to be used. Not really. They were meant to be seen. They were a signal, not a tool. And that gap between display and function tells us something genuinely interesting about the 1950s hosting system as a whole. Beauty in this world was often performing a role entirely separate from practicality. The towels said, "This household has standards." Whether a guest actually dried her hands was almost beside the point. From the powder room to the dining room, the visual architecture of the evening became even more deliberate. If the bathroom was about the standard a woman set for herself in private, the dining room was about the standard she set for her guests in public. And here, the 1950s hostess deployed a set of tricks so practical and so elegant that women's magazines published them openly, year after year, as though they were simply common sense. The most powerful of them had almost nothing to do with the food. The candelabra trick is one of the most elegant examples of practical stagecraft in the entire post-war hosting canon. Women's magazines and hostess manuals of the 1950s actively recommended low, warm candlelight at the dining table, and they gave two reasons for it. The first was the one everyone understood. Candlelight is flattering. It softens faces, warms skin tones, and makes every guest look their best. But the second reason was the one they said more quietly, and it was entirely practical. The second reason for the candelabra was this: warm, low candlelight concealed dust in the corners of the room. If a full, deep clean had not been possible in the days before the party, the soft amber glow of candles softened every surface, blurred every edge, and made the far corners of the dining room disappear into a pleasant dimness. The light was doing two jobs at once, flattering the guests and quietly covering for the hostess. It was practical stagecraft dressed up as romance, and it worked beautifully on both counts. What makes this trick so interesting is that it was published openly. Women's magazines in the 1950s did not frame it as a shortcut or a cheat. They presented it as good taste, as the correct way to light a dining room for company. The practical benefit of hiding an imperfect clean was simply folded into the aesthetic advice without comment. Nobody called it a workaround. It was just what you did. That combination of beauty and function, dressed up as pure elegance, is one of the signatures of the post-war hosting system at its most sophisticated. Picture that dining room on a Saturday evening in 1957. The overhead light is off entirely. Two candelabras stand at either end of the table, their flames steady in the still air. The white linen catches the warmth and glows back at the guests seated around it. The corners of the room are soft and indistinct. The flowers in the low centerpiece look like they were arranged by someone with time and artistry to spare. The whole room looks like a painting, and every person sitting in it looks better than they did when they walked through the front door. The centerpiece itself followed its own strict rule, one that modern hosts sometimes overlook entirely. Floral arrangements for the dining table were kept deliberately low. The reason was simple and social. Guests needed to be able to see each other across the table. A tall vase of gladiolas, however beautiful, created a visual wall down the center of the room and broke the party into two separate conversations. The low centerpiece, by contrast, kept the table unified. Every guest could make eye contact with every other guest, and the room stayed alive as a single gathering rather than splitting into factions. The menu itself was not left to personal preference or seasonal whim. Post-war hostess manuals enforced a clear and firm division. Hot, heavy foods belonged to winter entertaining, and cold foods were the exclusive domain of summer parties. This was not simply about comfort or practicality, though both mattered. It was about the experience of the guest. Serving a rich braised short rib in July was considered a failure of planning, an imposition on the people you had invited. The seasonal menu was an act of consideration, and the manuals treated it as such. The summer centerpiece that followed this seasonal logic most faithfully was the chilled gelatin salad, or aspic. By the mid-1950s, the aspic mold had become the signature dish of the warm-weather dinner party, and its popularity made complete sense within the hosting system. It was cold by design, which honored the seasonal rule. It was visually striking, arriving at the table in a molded shape that signaled effort and artistry. And it could be prepared the evening before the party, which gave the hostess one less thing to manage on the day itself. The aspic worked because it solved three problems at once. It held its shape from the refrigerator to the table without any last-minute attention. It looked impressive in a way that suggested the hostess had skill and patience, which she did, but the skill had been applied the night before, and it fit the cold food mandate for summer entertaining precisely. Women's magazines of the era published aspic recipes in nearly every summer issue throughout the 1950s, and the variations were endless. Tomato aspic, chicken aspic, fruit suspended in lime gelatin. The principle behind all of them was the same. Here is the misconception that trips people up every time they picture a 1950s dinner party. They imagine a woman who spent the entire day at the stove, flour on her apron, everything made lovingly from scratch. The reality was far more practical than that, and honestly, far more clever. Post-war America had just handed the middle-class housewife an entirely new arsenal of convenience foods, and she used every single one of them without a shred of apology. Canned cream of mushroom soup became the silent backbone of the post-war casserole. You opened a can, added a protein, topped it with crushed crackers, and slid it into the oven. Canned fruit, peaches, mandarin oranges, maraschino cherries, got suspended inside shimmering Jell-O molds that wobbled magnificently on a pedestal dish. The ingredients came from a tin. The result looked like something from a magazine centerfold, which was precisely the point. What the 1950s hostess understood, and what modern food culture sometimes forgets entirely, is that the skill was never about the raw ingredients. It was about the presentation, the plating, the moment of reveal when the dish arrived at the table looking like genuine effort had been lavished on it. Abundance was the message. Care was the message. Whether that care came from a garden or a can was nobody's business but hers. Picture her at the kitchen counter on a Saturday afternoon. She opens 3 cans of cream of mushroom soup, one after the other, the lids curling back with that familiar metallic sigh. She folds in cooked chicken, a handful of frozen peas, a sprinkle of paprika across the top for color. Into the oven it goes. By the time her guests arrive 2 hours later, the kitchen smells of something slow and homey, and the dish on the table looks entirely, convincingly homemade. So the food was managed. The pantry was stocked, the casserole was in the oven, the Jell-O mold was chilling in the refrigerator. But the 1950s hostess understood that a dinner party was not just a meal. It was a social performance with its own invisible architecture, and the dining table itself was only one part of it. The room, the seating, the flow of the evening, all of it was engineered with a quiet, deliberate hand. Trick number 8 is one that surprises people most when they first hear it. The seating arrangement at a 1950s dinner party was not casual or accidental. Hostess manuals were explicit on this point. You separated couples, you placed the talkers next to the quieter guests, and you thought carefully about who would draw out whom. It was social engineering dressed up in linen napkins, and it worked. The reasoning was straightforward, and frankly, generous. If you seated a husband and wife together, they defaulted to their private conversation, and the rest of the table fragmented into isolated pairs. But separate them. Place her next to a witty neighbor and him next to someone who shared his interest in baseball or business, and suddenly the whole table became one living, breathing conversation. The hostess had engineered connection without anyone noticing she had done it. The goal, as one post-war hostess manual put it, was a room that felt alive. Not a collection of private couples sitting in parallel, but a single social organism where every person felt drawn into something larger than their own household. That is a sophisticated ambition for a Saturday night in a suburban split level. And the hostess achieved it by thinking about chairs and names on small folded cards 2 days in advance. Now we arrive at one of the most quietly elegant tricks in the entire post-war hostess playbook, and it involves a coffee percolator. At some point in the evening, when the dessert plates had been cleared and the conversation had reached its natural plateau, the hostess would appear from the kitchen carrying the percolator on a tray alongside a small plate of mince or petits fours. She set it down. She poured, and the party was over. Nobody announced it. Nobody said anything as direct as "it is getting late" or "we have church in the morning." The percolator did all of that work silently. Guests understood they had roughly 1 hour to finish their coffee, say their goodbyes, and collect their coats. It was a social contract written in steam and chrome, and it functioned perfectly because everyone had grown up understanding the same unspoken language. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew, and more importantly, every guest knew. The Percolator Signal was one of those pieces of social fluency that existed entirely in the unspoken register, passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, absorbed through 100 evenings of watching how the room changed the moment that Trey appeared. It required no explanation because it had never needed one. What strikes me most about the Percolator Signal is its elegance. There was no awkward announcement, no visible fatigue creeping into the hostess's expression, no husband making pointed remarks about the time. The evening simply began to close, gently and warmly, the way a good book does in its final chapter. The guests felt grateful rather than dismissed. The hostess retained her composure entirely. It was a masterclass in social grace disguised as a hot beverage. Picture the moment. She comes through the kitchen door, the percolator balanced on the tray, the plate of mints arranged just so. She sets it on the side table near the fireplace and begins pouring without fanfare. Across the room, almost imperceptibly, something shifts. A guest glances at a watch. Another straightens slightly in her chair. A husband catches his wife's eye. The coats will appear within the hour, and the hostess has not said a single word to make it happen. Let us address the misconception that sits at the heart of almost every romanticized image of the 1950s hostess. She was not naturally calm. She was not born unruffled. The serenity you saw when she opened the front door was the product of a schedule that had been running since Tuesday, a checklist that had been executed with military precision, and a very deliberate decision to let none of that show on her face when the doorbell rang. The stakes behind that engineered calm were genuinely high, and the hostess manuals of the era acknowledged this openly. Entertaining in the 1950s was not purely social, it was professional. A husband standing at his firm, his relationships with colleagues, his reputation with the boss, all of it could be quietly advanced or quietly damaged by how an evening in his home unfolded. The housewife was, in a very real sense, managing her family's upward mobility from the kitchen. Hosting the boss for dinner was not a casual invitation. Postwar manuals treated it as a professional audition conducted in the dining room. The food needed to signal competence without ostentation. The conversation needed to be lively but never controversial. The children needed to be seen briefly and then not heard. And the wife, who had orchestrated every element of the evening, needed to appear as though it had all come together effortlessly, because effort, visibly displayed, was considered its own kind of failure. Picture her at 7:15 on a Friday evening. The guests due at 7:30. She stands at the head of the dining table and makes one final pass. She straightens a fork by a fraction of an inch. She adjusts a wine glass. She checks that the candles are lit and that the centerpiece is not so tall it will block the sight lines. Her husband's name is on a list for a promotion that will be decided in the next 30 days. Tonight is not just dinner. Tonight is part of that decision. Trick number 10 is one that modern hosts almost never think about consciously, even though we still feel its effects when we walk into a room. Every element of the 1950s table setting was a form of silent communication. It told your guests, before a single word was spoken, exactly what kind of evening this was going to be. And the hostess chose every element with that message in mind. Linen napkins instead of paper said, "This is a formal evening. Come prepared for real conversation." Crystal glasses instead of everyday tumblers said, "We are celebrating something, even if that something is simply your presence here." Candles instead of the overhead light said, "Warmth matters more than brightness tonight." Every substitution carried meaning. The hostess was writing a sentence about the evening before anyone had taken their coat off, and her guests were reading it fluently. There is one detail of the mid-century table setting that catches people off guard when they encounter it in old photographs or vintage magazines. Ashtrays were placed at intervals along the table as a standard part of the setting, as unremarkable as the salt and pepper shakers. It is simply a historical detail, a marker of how thoroughly the era's habits differed from our own, and it tells us that the table setting was always a mirror of its moment in time, nothing more and nothing less. There was one more trick that separated a truly skilled hostess from a merely competent one, and it had nothing to do with food or table settings. It was called the graceful disappearance. A good hostess could vanish from the room mid-conversation, slip into the kitchen for 2 or 3 minutes, and return looking as though she had simply stepped out to admire the garden. No apology, no visible hurry, no flustered expression. She came back composed, refreshed, ready for the next course as though time had briefly paused in her absence. The phrase she used was always something quiet and unspecific. She would say she was going to check on something, and that was understood by everyone at the table to mean exactly nothing alarming. It was a piece of social code. What she was actually doing in those 2 or 3 minutes was taking a breath, straightening her posture in front of the kitchen window, checking that the next course was plated and ready, and resetting her expression before walking back out. The kitchen was backstage, the dining room was the stage. That line was never crossed in the other direction. The manuals were remarkably consistent on this point. Never let a guest see you stressed, rushed, or uncertain. One widely circulated guide from the mid-1950s phrased it this way: "A guest who senses difficulty begins to feel guilt, and a guilty guest cannot be a comfortable one." The hostess's composure was not vanity. It was a gift she gave to the people sitting at her table. She absorbed the chaos so they never had to feel it. That is a level of emotional labor that most modern hosting guides do not even think to name, let alone teach. Now here is a historical detail that tells you everything about how real the pressure actually was. As home hosting expectations peaked in the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, something interesting happened in American dining culture. Steakhouses and supper clubs began marketing themselves specifically as the dinner party solution. You could take your guests out, order the classic hostess menu, have a perfectly set table, and go home without doing a single dish. The restaurant industry was, in part, built on the exhaustion of the solo post-war housewife. The menu those restaurants offered was almost identical to what a skilled 1950s hostess would have served at home. A chilled prawn cocktail to start, a properly cooked steak as the centerpiece, and something rich and layered for dessert. That specific sequence became a restaurant formula precisely because it had already been perfected in thousands of suburban dining rooms by women who had no professional training and no kitchen staff. The restaurant industry borrowed the hostess's playbook and put it on a printed menu. Most people never made that connection, and that tells us something important. The tricks worked. The illusion was convincing. Guests left those evenings feeling genuinely cared for, genuinely comfortable, genuinely impressed. But the labor behind that illusion was real, and it was exhausting, and it fell almost entirely on one person. The fact that restaurants could build a profitable business model around replicating the experience is the clearest possible proof that what these women were producing had genuine value. It was craft. It was skill. It just happened to be invisible, unpaid, and taken entirely for granted. This is where I want to be careful, because I think honoring these women properly means holding two things at once. The artistry was real. The system was sophisticated, and the weight of carrying it alone, every time, with no acknowledgement and no credit, was genuinely heavy. We do not need to pretend the 1950s were a golden age to appreciate what these women knew, and we do not need to dismiss what they knew in order to acknowledge that the arrangement was not fair. Both things are true. The tricks were brilliant. The circumstances that required them were not always kind. So, what can a modern host actually borrow from all of this? Quite a bit, it turns out, without borrowing the pressure that came with it. The emergency shelf is genuinely useful. A small, dedicated reserve of shelf-stable items that you never raid on a Tuesday means you are always ready to receive someone graciously. The scent ritual, the idea of being aware of how your home and your hands smell before guests arrive, costs nothing and takes 3 minutes. The 30-minute rule, finishing your preparation early enough to compose yourself before the door opens, changes the entire feeling of the evening. And the percolator signal. That one is worth reviving in any form that fits your life. The idea of a warm, wordless, gracious way to signal the end of an evening without anyone feeling pushed out is genuinely elegant. What we do not need to bring back is the crushing perfectionism, the idea that every seam must be invisible, that asking for help is failure, that the effort itself must never be seen or acknowledged. The 1950s hostess hid her labor because the culture demanded it. We do not have to. We can borrow the intention and leave the invisibility behind. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. In 2026, research is showing that younger generations are throwing more dinner parties than any age group in recent memory. Gen Z, the generation that grew up with delivery apps and group chats, is setting tables and cooking for friends. But the interesting thing is that they are doing it without the architecture. They want the warmth and the connection, and they are finding their way toward it instinctively, which means they are rediscovering piece by piece what your grandmother already knew. Your grandmother knew something they are only just now finding. That is the real lesson underneath all of these tricks. Gathering people in a home is a craft, and craft requires preparation, attention, and care. It requires thinking ahead, the emergency shelf stocked 2 days early. It requires thinking about the senses, the scent of cinnamon on the back burner, the soft amber of candlelight. It requires thinking about how people feel, not just what they eat. The 1950s hostess understood that an evening in someone's home is a designed experience and that the design is an act of love. That truth never went out of style, even when the rule book did. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody said out loud. These women did not write manifestos. They did not give TED Talks. They passed things down through watching, through a hand on a shoulder in a kitchen, through a daughter standing in the doorway while her mother swapped one apron for another 10 minutes before the doorbell rang. The attic remembers, even when we forget. The embroidered hostess apron folded in a cedar chest, the handwritten menu card tucked inside a cookbook, the percolator sitting on a shelf in an antique shop. They are all still speaking, if you know what you are looking at. What the vanished hostess tricks really reveal, when you lay them all out together, is not a list of tips. It is a portrait of intention. Every single one of those practices, the emergency shelf, the scent ritual, the double apron, the 30-minute window, the powder room inspection, the candlelight, the seasonal menu, the seating plan, the percolator signal, was a way of saying to another person, I thought about you before you arrived. I prepared this space for you. You are worth the effort. That message, delivered without a word, is what made people feel welcomed in a way that is genuinely hard to replicate by accident. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Did your mother or your grandmother have a trick like these? Something she always did before company came? Something so practiced and quiet that you almost did not notice it until years later? A certain way she arranged the bathroom, a smell she always had going on the stove, a particular apron she only wore for guests? I would genuinely love to know. Leave it in the comments below because those details are exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to rescue before they disappear completely. I will see you in the next one.